This video explains how to create insightful data visualizations using the ggplot2 package in the R programming language. And in this video we have a special guest. His name is Albert Rapp and he's a math PhD student, content creator and freelancer. And he's an absolute expert when it comes to data visualizations in R programming. Albert has recently launched a course with the name Insightful Data Visualizations for the Uncreative R user. And I highly recommend checking out this course because in this course you will learn even more tricks than in this video. So thanks a lot to Albert for his contribution, and without too much talk, I'll hand it over to him.
Hi everyone, and thank you Joachim for having me on the Statistics Slope channel. Today I'm going to show you how to create 5 essential charts with ggplot so that you can use that code as a template when you want to create similar charts with your own data. My name is Albert Rapp and I help people create insightful data visualization, and this video is part of my course release where I help people do exactly that. If you are interested in this video course, then Joachim will put a link to this course into the description of this video. But if you're just here to enjoy some free content, then I completely understand. And with that said, let's dive right into the lesson. ggplot2 is an incredibly powerful tool to create beautiful charts with R, but it can be hard to keep all the moving parts in mind when you are beginning with ggplot. So it helps to have a few examples to get started. And in this video I show you how to create the most common chart types with ggplot2. Now, before we dive in, let me mention that this video is a companion piece to an actual ggplot2 guide that I've recorded. You can find the link to that video either via the description of this video, or there should be a notification popping up right about now. So if you find anything in this video that you do not understand, then chances are that it is probably explained in the other video. And with that said, let's dive into the examples. In my Quarto file, you will find a first code chunk that will load the tidyverse, which ggplot is part of, and then load a data set that looks like this. The data is coming from Tidy Tuesday, and you can find all of the code that we have here inside of the blog post that corresponds to this video, and you will find a link to that in the description of this video too. Now, this dataset contains stock prices of different stocks. In this case, we see that one of the stock symbols is AAPL, which if you're like me, you won't know. But since I know this dataset, I know that this is Apple, so we can visualize the stock price of Apple over time. So let's create a new code chunk. And in there, we can take our data set, pass it to the filter function so that it filters for only the Apple stocks. And then we save this into a new data set, which we call Apple prices. Now, to create a line chart from this data set, we have to take it and then pass it to ggplot, where we specify the aesthetics in the AES call, where we map the X aesthetic to the date column, so to the dates that we have in this column here. And on the y-axis, we want to use the closing prices of that stock on that given day. And once we have that, we can add a layer on top of that. In this case, since we want to have a line chart, we'll add a GM line on top of that. And now if we execute this, we'll get a line chart like this. Actually, this is a bit large, so let's make it a little bit smaller here. Now let's not stick to the complete basic output. Let's modify this a little bit to make it look nicer. For starters, we could modify the line color to make it blue and make it thicker via the line width argument. Also, any chart should have descriptive labels, so we should modify the labels here a little bit, and we can do all of that via the labs layer. Here I've added this on top of our chart, and then we can go through the labels one by one. First, we give this chart a title. And then I can also put in a caption to signal where I've got this data from. And then on the x-axis, I actually don't need a label because everyone will probably be able to tell that these labels represent years, so it's the dates. So in this case, I put an element blank to get rid of the label altogether. And then on the y-axis, I use price, but I should probably put in something like closing price to be precise. And now with that, I have nicer labels for my chart. Now, it is nice that ggplot gives us this gray background here and puts on a theme for the plot so we don't have to think about it. But usually what I like to do is to move a little bit away from the default looks just to signal that I did something with the chart to the readers who will have to read my chart. What I like to do is to add a theme minimal on top, which will get rid of the gray background. And the great thing about this layer is that I can specify the base size in there, which will automatically make the fonts larger. Well, it will only do that if I increase the font size, but the point here is to set this number to something so that the font is legible. And then I also usually like to use a different font family, in this case Source Sans Pro, to make it look nicer. Don't worry if you don't have that font installed, you don't even have to change the font. One thing I do encourage you to do is to increase the font size to really make sure that everyone can read your chart. And while we are changing the theme, we can also apply our custom changes on top of this theme minimal. And what I usually do is get rid of some of the grid lines, namely those minor grid lines, by setting panel grid minor to element blank, just like we did with the labels before, to get rid of those. That way the chart is a little bit less cluttered, it's a little bit cleaner that way. And that's it. With that, we have a nice line chart, and we've also created a very small theme that we can reuse with all the other charts that we will create in this video. Now, I'm sure that you usually don't want to have only one line in your chart, but multiple ones, so let's accommodate that. Here we just have to replace our data set with this data set over here, but we still should make sure that we don't plot too many lines, so let's filter our data set nonetheless, but we will make sure that this part here is different. Namely, we want to check for a couple of stock symbols. So let's take the one from before, the Apple one, and let's also use the Amazon one. This way I have all the stock closing prices from Apple and Amazon. And now if I execute all of this, we'll actually get a very weird chart because it's trying to connect both lines instead of drawing two separate lines. It's trying to connect the two lines, and this is why it's always going back and forth here. Looks kind of cool, but it's not really what we wanted. So let's map our color aesthetic to the stock symbol. So we're going to use the color aesthetic here and map it to the stock symbol to tell ggplot to use different colors depending on whether we have Apple or Amazon. Now this still doesn't work because we have hard coded the color here, and if we do that, it will automatically override what we do in the aesthetic here. So let's remove this part here, and once we do that, we get two separate lines. And now we also have a legend over here. So let's add this to the labels function. So here we can modify the label that we see in the legend. Here we want to maybe name this company. And that way we have company in here. But really the labels here are not that nice. We should probably modify this. And the easiest way to do that is to modify what we have in our data set. Right now, the legend only contains those symbols that we have here. But if we transform that to say Apple instead of AAPL, then we will also see Apple inside of the legend. So let's put a mutate call in here, and then we can modify the stock symbol here. In this case, we can simply use case when to check whether the stock symbol is AAPL. If that's the case, we simply replace the word with Apple, and we do the same thing with Amazon. And now if we execute only this part here, we see that we have Apple in the stock symbol column. So this means we can just pass this to ggplot, and then the labels will change here. And this reminds me, if you get a lot of value from this video, don't forget to hit that like button because this supports my work. So thank you for that, and let's get back to the video. So that was how to create a line chart. Let's create a bar chart next. So let's make a new code chunk here. Let me move this up a little bit to give us some room. Let's even indicate that we're going to do a bar chart here. And then let's grab some data. In this case, I'm going to use data from the NYC Flights 13 package. If you don't have that, you can simply install it by running install packages and then putting NYC Flights 13 in there. And from there, I will get the flights data set. It looks like this. It has a huge amount of rows, and it shows you all of the flights that left New York City from one of the airports in the year 2013. And with that data set, we can filter for those flights that actually departed. So this means that they don't have a missing value in the departure time column. And this is exactly what we have in the filter condition here. And once we do that, we see that we have a couple of less rows here. Before that, it was higher than after filtering. So this means that we got rid of those flights that didn't actually depart. Now with this data set, we can count the origins. So this means how many flights departed from JFK, LaGuardia, or Newark International. And we can save this data set into a new variable called flights count. And then we could look at this again, or we can pass this to ggplot. So once we have the ggplot layer, we can specify the aesthetics. On the y-axis, I want to use the airports. Usually I like to use the y coordinates for my bar charts so that I can have long text labels on the y-axis. We'll later transform those things here to JFK, LaGuardia, so the full words. And when these things are on the y-axis, it usually looks nicer. So that's why we go with this. On the x-axis, we want to use the counted values here. And now to make this into a bar chart, we have to add a gm-col layer. And once we have that, we automatically get a bar chart. And the nice thing is we can immediately take our theme from before and throw that on here. and have it look a little bit nicer. But this shouldn't stop us from customizing our chart nonetheless. In this case, we could start with making the fill color different. Make sure that you're using the fill aesthetic and not the color aesthetic, otherwise you won't have this nice fill color here, but rather the outline of these rectangles differently colored. And also we can add labels again via the labs layer. In this case, I actually get rid of the X and Y labels because I can throw in all of the information I need into the title, where it says number of flights leaving New York City in 2013. And then people can kind of figure out that these are airports and these are numbers here. But this will become even more obvious once we have changed these abbreviations to actual names so that it's immediately clear that these are airports. Once again, we do that by using a mutate call before the data goes into ggplot, and here we modify the origins column that we have mapped on the Y aesthetic, and we use again case when to modify the abbreviations. So for origin equal to EWR, we translate this to Newark Liberty Airport. We do the same thing for JFK and the same thing for LaGuardia. And once you have that, you will see that you have nice labels over here now. And again, because these labels are on the y-axis now, they are still very legible and we don't have to be afraid that they might overlap if the labels become too long, which is something that can commonly happen if you put labels on the x-axis. So this is why I usually prefer horizontal bar charts here. Alright, cool, this was a bar chart. Now let's do something similar. Let's do a histogram. Once again, we create a new code chunk for this, but we're actually going to use the same data set. So let's just copy this part here, and we can actually save this into a new variable. Let's call this departed flights. And creating a histogram is really easy in ggplot. You just take your data set, pass it to ggplot, map the aesthetics again, but this time you actually only have to map one aesthetic because the other aesthetic, what goes on the other axis in the histogram, will be calculated from ggplot. So here on the x-axis, we just put in the departure delay, and then we add a GM histogram layer, and with that we immediately get a histogram. But this histogram isn't too nice. For starters, the labels are weird, and there's basically just one large bar that tells us that most of the flights happen between, say, -10 minutes and +10 minutes departure delay. That's not very informative, so let's change that. What we could do here is to change the bin width to make sure that ggplot doesn't just use a fixed number of bins. Here it tells us that it uses 30 bins, so we can see at most 30 bars here. But if we specify the bin width like ggplot suggests, then we can actually modify these things. So here let's just use 5-minute bins to have like a really detailed view of how the delays are distributed. So if you put in bin width equal to 5, then we get a nicer overview. At least the numbers are nicer now, we can actually read those things, but still most of the things happen over here, so we should zoom into this. And the way to zoom in ggplot is to use a different coordinate system, basically one that covers only the range from, say, -20 to 300. That will probably be enough to cover most of what we see here. The reason why ggplot shows such a huge axis is because there are some flights probably that have a huge delay, like 1,000 minutes, but we cannot really see it because it happens very rarely, and therefore the bar height is really small and we cannot see a thing. But there's nothing wrong of zooming into the relevant part here or the most common cases, and we do that again by coord Cartesian, and in there we specify the x limits, where we set it to a vector that contains two numbers, namely the left number, in this case -20 to 300, which is the right end of the axis. And once we execute this, we can see that the axis now goes all the way to 300 and it stops at -20 here. And just like before, we can take our theme that we have already assembled and throw this in here again, and we get a nicer look. We can change the fill color again, so let's put in Dodger Blue 4 again to have this nice bluish color. And finally, we need better labels to describe what we actually see here, because it's never good practice to use these variable names like dep_delay to signal what you have on an axis. You should always try to make the labels human readable and not use the dataset labels. So here we use the labs function again. On the x-axis we put in departure delay. On the y-axis we actually don't need anything because we can put that stuff into the title saying number of delayed flights leaving New York City in 2013, and then it's clear that these numbers here are the counts. For our next chart we are going to recreate a famous chart from Hans Rosling, namely a bubble chart, but we're going to start out with a scatter plot and then turn this into a bubble chart. It's really easy once you have a scatter plot to turn this into a bubble chart. The first thing that you need is the gapminder dataset, which looks like this, and it shows you stuff like life expectancy, population, and GDP per capita for different countries from all of the continents in different years. So what you could do with this data set is filter it so that it only contains data from 2007. I think this is as high as it goes in this data set. And once you have that, you can pass this to ggplot, where you map the aesthetics again. On the x-axis, you can use GDP per capita, this column here. On the y-axis, you can use the life expectancy. And then to make a scatter plot, simply put this to gm point. And once you execute this, you will get, well, a bunch of points, which is nothing but a scatter plot. The default points are pretty boring, so let's give them a nicer color and also make them a little bit larger. And just like before, we're going to use a nicer theme here to make everything, especially the font, larger. And the larger fonts wouldn't be any use if we didn't have nice labels. So let's add those too via the labs layer again. On the x-axis, we use GDP per capita in US dollars. On the y-axis, life expectancy. And as a title, we use something kind of generic for demonstration's sake like this. It's okay here. We say life expectancies and GDP per capita and 2007. Usually I like to put into the title something that is insightful, some trend I have seen or whatever, just so that the reader immediately has something to know what's going on in this chart. These are things that I cover in my data visualization course. If you're interested in that, you can find the link to the course in the description below. But here for a simple demo of basic charts, it's no problem to use like a generic title like this. Now, to make this chart more informative, we could actually not use a fixed color for all the points. We could maybe change the color depending on the continent. So let's remove that and instead put the color inside of the AES and map that to the continent column, which is also available inside of our data set. It is this one here. Otherwise, it wouldn't really make sense to map something which is not in a data set. So here I just wanted to show you again, this is the column here. Kind of self-explanatory what it does, but once you execute this, you can actually see that the points that have really low life expectancies in 2007 are mostly the countries from Africa, which you can see by comparing the color to the legend here. And you see here that the red points correspond to Africa. And now that we do have a legend, we should also make sure that it has a nice label. Here, let's just put in the color aesthetic inside of the labs function. We can assign labels for the legend just like that too. Everything works within the labs layer. And here we simply use continent, but let's just write this with a capital letter. Cool, we have a nice scatter plot. Time to turn this into a bubble chart. And the thing that makes a bubble chart is that points are differently sized depending on some quantity. So instead of using a fixed value for size here, we, just like with color, we throw this inside of the AES call and map this to some quantity that we have inside of our data set. And in this case, it's the column, which you can find once you look at the data set again. And once you execute this, you will get another legend, but you will also see that the points are differently sized now. But since points may overlap quite a lot now, let's also make them a little bit transparent by setting the alpha value to something like 0.8. Now that we have another legend, we could also make sure that there is a nice label here like population, but really it's usually hard to compare these point sizes anyway, so I don't think that it is that helpful to have this legend in here, so let's just remove it instead. This will make our chart a little bit inaccurate because people cannot really tell what size this corresponds to, but if this is not our goal, if we don't want to show really exact quantities for the population, then just having an impression of larger points correspond to larger populations will be enough. So here, to get rid of the extra legend, we have to use a different layer, namely the guides layer. Let me just scroll a little bit down here so that we have more space. And in this guides layer, we can target all the aesthetics that we want to change. In this case, we want to change the size aesthetic, and we set this to some other guide. And there are lots of guides. They all start with guide. And what we want to do is to get rid of the guide. So we use guide none. And once we execute this, that guide is gone. Nice, that's our bubble chart. It is a recreation of Hans Rosling's famous Gapminder visualization. In his visualization, it is actually a moving image. It shows you how the points move across time. Here we only have one static image. If you're interested in that, you can easily find the video that shows you the full animation via YouTube. And instead of trying to animate this, let us move on to our last chart of this video, namely heat maps. Here I want to create a heat map that uses the flights data set before, so this departed flights data set. And from that data, I want to compute on which weekdays of which week, how many flights left New York City on that given day. And once I have that data, I want to visualize it using a heat map. So let's take this data set and compute the stuff that we need for that first. The trick here is to use the information from the year, month, and day column to compute another column that makes this into a date. So first we put in a mutate call, and then we compute the date via makeDate, which is a function from the tidyverse, and then we put in div columns that actually define a date, namely year, month, and day. And once we have that new column, which I have called date, we can compute the week of the year by using the week function on that date. Pretty convenient. And then we can also do the same thing for the workday using the wday function, but I want to make sure that my week starts on Monday, so I have to set week start to 1. And once we have that, we can just count the week and day that we've just computed via the count function. And if we execute this, we get actually all of the counts. So we can see here in week 1 of 2013, we see that on day 6, which should be Saturday, we have 717 flights leaving New York City on that day. So let's save this into a variable. Let's call this flights day count. Yeah, solid name. Let's go with that one. And now to create a heat map, we have to create a lot of rectangles that basically use these things as the x and y coordinates of the center of that rectangle. And once we have a lot of rectangles, they will all be in different rows. We can map the fill color of those rectangles to the numbers that we have in the end column here. This is how we generate a heat map. Let me show you how that works in code, and then things will hopefully be more clear. So we take our data set, we pass it to ggplot, and we specify it as static as usual. On the x-axis, I want to show the week number, and on the y-axis, I want to show the day number. Remember, this will be a number between 1 and 7, and then it will move on to the next column for the next week and so on. And then we map the fill aesthetic to this column. And once we have that, we add a GM tile layer, which does exactly that. It plots rectangles which are centered at x and y coordinates. And here we map the filling of those rectangles to this end column. And if we execute all of this, then we get a plot like this, which already starts to look like a heat map. Here I usually want to have an outline of my rectangles, so I set the color to something like white. I just have to be able to spell white properly, and then I get a white outline for each rectangle. But these are rectangles and I kind of want to have squares, so I have to enforce that the y-axis and the x-axis use the same aspect ratio. This means that I have to modify the coordinate system, and here there is a function for that called chord equal. And if I execute this, this looks more like squares now instead of having rectangles. It just looks much nicer that way. In a situation like this, we usually want to represent higher numbers with darker colors and vice versa. But by default, ggplot does it the other way around. You can see here that 1000, the highest number, gets the lightest color. We want to switch that. And the way to do that is to use a scale layer. In this case, we're using scale fill gradient. And from the name, you can see that it targets the fill aesthetic. Just like there is a scale fill layer, there's a scale X layer, there's a scale Y layer. For all the aesthetic that you map, you always have a scale layer. And here we want to use the special gradient layer, because in that layer we can specify the colors that are used for high and low colors simply by using the low argument and the high argument. And if we execute all of this, we get a nice plot like this. And here we can see that the 6th day of the week, which is Saturday in my counting, is actually the day with the lowest amount of lights. That's kind of a neat pattern to notice, and we've noticed that due to this heat map that we have created. Now for the final time, we can actually reuse our theme from before. Let's put this in here. Looks a little bit better, but we also want to have better labels. So let's use a labs layer again. On the x-axis, I will use week. On the y-axis, I will use weekday. As a title, I will use number of flights leaving New York City in 2013. And for the fill aesthetic, I simply use flights. Now I am a bit unhappy with the labels here because people will have no clue what the 6th day is. It really depends on how you count. So let's make this pretty straightforward to read by actually using the names like Saturday, Monday, and so on. And the way to do that, as usual, is to modify what we give to ggplot by modifying the stuff that is inside of the dataset. So let's put in a mutate call again. And in there, we modify this day column here with a case when function again. And then we just have to go through all of the days. If the number is 1, we want to say it's Monday. And then we do that for all of the other days too. And now if we execute this, then we see that it looks a little bit terrible because there's not enough room. But also the labels got all mixed up. It is not in the typical order that we expect from a week. It is actually sorted in alphabetical order, which is not something we want. So we will change that in a second. But first, let's get rid of this weekday label because we don't need that stuff anymore, because really everyone can tell that this is a weekday if they read Saturday. So let's put in element blank again. And the only way to make sure that the stuff that we have on here is sorted the way we want is to make sure that the corresponding column is represented as a factor variable. This means we have to modify this part here once it is converted from number to day. So let's make some room here, and then we will modify the day column again. In this case, we use the factor function to say this should become a factor, and we use the levels argument to indicate what the levels of the factor are. And the levels then determine the order that we see inside of the plot. So really I have to put in a vector here that says Monday, Tuesday, and so on. So once you put all of the stuff in there like this and execute this, everything is in the order as it should be. Finally, another thing that we could tweak in this is to move the color bar here to the top of the chart. And the way to do that is to, inside of theme, use the legend position argument and set that to top. But once you execute this, you will get a really terrible legend here. The numbers are quite close and the bar is just too short. And just like before where we wanted to get rid of a legend, we can modify the legend using the guides layer again. So once we add a guides layer, we can target the aesthetic that we want to modify. In this case, it's the fill aesthetic. And in there, we need to use a guide again, and we can go through all of them here. And we will see that, okay, color bar pretty much sounds like what we have here right now. So let's do that. And inside of there, we can use the bar width argument and set this to some unit. It's a bit annoying, but we have to use units here. Just use a number and then use the unit that you want. I use centimeters because I'm a fan of the metric system. And once that is done, we can see that the bar is much nicer now. And with that, we have concluded our video for today. You have learned 5 common chart types and how to create them in ggplot. You can find all of the code for this on my blog. The link for that is in the description. And if you're interested in learning how to create beautiful charts that communicate effectively, then also check out my video course. The link for that is in the description as well. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.